Welcome to the Today's Leader podcast, the podcast for the leaders and entrepreneurs of today.
Way to go, guys. Way to go. Keep it going. Good job, guys. All right, Paul, I see you. All right, Trevor, finish on. Good call.
Hey there, it's Coach Curl here, and welcome to the Today's Leader podcast. As has become increasingly common, Australia is once again in the midst of a natural disaster. We have an extended rain period that's been occurring now over the last week on the east coast of Australia, pretty much stretching from Sydney all the way through to, central Queensland. And we've got a large number of our population that are being affected by floods, that are being affected by this particular natural catastrophe. So, of course, my thoughts go out to everyone that has been affected. And it's been quite chilling to see the photos that are coming out of a place like Windsor in Western Sydney. Now, for people that you won't know this, but the Curl family, I have a large array of the Curl family in that area. In fact, if you go to the cemeteries in Pitt Town and Windsor, there is a long line of Curls that have been buried there. So to all my family, to all my friends there in Windsor and surrounding districts, I hope that you haven't been affected, and if you are, obviously just yell out, and we'll be there to support in whichever way we can. Today's podcast features a gentleman called Bretton Putter. Now, Brett is quite an amazing guy. He talks about culture like it's his. He speaks culture. He doesn't speak English. He speaks culture. He's the CEO of CultureGene, a cultural leadership software and services platform. And prior to founding CultureGene, Brett spent 16 years as the managing partner of a leading executive search firm based in London, working with startups and high-growth companies in the UK, Europe and the USA. He's a published author. In 2018, he published his first book, Culture Decks Decoded. And his second book, Own the Culture, How to Define, Embed and Manage Your Company Culture, came out in September 2020. Now, we had some issues technology-wise prior to the podcast, but we're now recording the podcast on a new platform called Riverside. And the sound and the quality, I hope you'll notice, is much better. So even though we had some hiccups with the internet early, it really didn't affect the quality of the sound. So a big shout out to the folk at Riverside. Fantastic platform. And I look forward to doing more and more podcast interviews. Anyway, after a word from our sponsor, I bring you Bretton Putter.
The podcast is brought to you by Think and Grow Business, the home of the Think and Grow Business Mastermind. If you're serious about growing your business, get serious and join a mastermind group today. Find out more at thinkandgrowbusiness.com.au.
Now, it's my pleasure to welcome to the Today's Leader podcast. I have Bretton Putter. Brett, how are you?
Tony, I'm really good, thanks. Thanks for having me on the show.
And I'm glad that we've still got good spirits. We've had some hiccups making this happen today. The internet hasn't necessarily played well for us, but we're here and we're ready to go. So, Brett, give us the condensed version. Give us the Bretton Putter story.
Well, I'm originally South African, so I appreciate the rugby and the battles that go on, and I miss rugby at the moment. Moved over to the UK in 99, so 22 years ago now. I ran an executive search firm working with high growth companies, helping them find C-level and VP level leaders everywhere between Moscow and San Francisco for 16 years. And then 4 years ago, I set up CultureGene, which is a company culture development platform, which is really a combination of culture consultancy, and human expertise.
Excellent. And you've written a couple of books about company culture. It's obviously quite important with you. Your latest one, let me just double check this, Own Your Culture, How to Define, Embed and Manage Your Company Culture. So what compelled you to dive into this space?
So I was very lucky to work with 5 years ago to work with 3 companies almost in a row where I was helping them doing senior level searches.
Yeah.
And these 3 leaders all had a very clear understanding of their culture. And I was asked to find candidates with the right skills, experience, and match with the values of the company. And this was new because I wasn't ever asked about culture or to find any sort of relation to company culture. And the fact that they happened almost consecutively meant that it really made a big impact on me, because the searches ran completely differently. The interactions were different, the results were different, the candidate interviews were different, and then the actual impact that the candidates had on the companies was significant and different. And this is where the penny dropped for me. I realized there's something here that I have to explore in a little bit more detail.
Okay, so how do you define this thing called culture? Because there's a lot of people talking about it now and a lot of people understanding the importance, but how do you define it?
So company culture for me is quite broad necessarily because your culture touches every part of your business. So the preferred definition I like is the way we do things around here.
Okay.
And it's essentially company cultures learned over time. So when you found the business and you learn what works and what doesn't, and you then adapt and you then take on those learnings, and your behaviors, your habits, your rituals, your communication styles, and various other points get bundled into what ultimately becomes your culture, which initially in the early days for most companies forms by default rather than is deliberately developed.
Yeah, you can feel a culture, can't you? Yeah,
very much so. You can feel a strong culture and you can feel a weak culture as well.
Yeah. So, and I guess when we're talking about historically, a lot of people would sort of pin their culture on the wall, as in they've got their vision or their mission statement, and potentially the actual culture is one that was sometimes in complete contrast to what was written up on the wall. How is the pandemic that we've all been going through and just continue to go through, how is that affecting company culture?
Yeah, so the pandemic is having a really big impact on company culture. In my most recent book, Own Your Culture, I quote Warren Buffett, who said that you only find out who's swimming naked when the tide goes out. And basically, this pandemic is like a tsunami tide going out, in that you really can see which leaders invested in their culture and which leaders didn't. And the leaders who didn't invest in their culture pre-COVID and relied on their offices to do it for them are the ones who are finding this transition that much harder, because there isn't that foundational DNA that they have that the other leaders have got. They're also, I think one of the challenges is most leaders are hoping that when we go back to the new normal, which is going to be some sort of hybrid work, that I can run my business the way I did pre-COVID.
Yeah.
And that is wrong, fundamentally wrong. And I think that's a really big mistake that leaders are making now.
So what you're seeing is that people are believing that this shift to whether it be work from home or remote leadership is a temporary thing, and that they're longing for the days that they can just go back to the old ways.
Yeah, there is a big group of leaders who are longing for that, but there are also leaders who realize that the remote work or work from home, that horse is bolted, and it's definitely not coming back into the stable in a hurry. Yeah. But they think that, okay, well, that's fine. We'll have some people working from home and some people working from the office and some people working on Mondays and Wednesdays and other people working fully remote. And it's this multidimensional new environment that's going to take place. And they don't realize that actually you require a fundamentally different leadership approach to this because you have people working remotely. And the reason for this is that in pre-COVID, we had the four walls of the office doing that work for us.
Yep.
The informal communication, the osmosis, the visibility, the availability, the trust that developed because of this experience of seeing one another and interacting with one another. Those things are not going to be the same now. So there's no osmosis. Trust will be very hard to build for new people joining a company. And the requirements around this area is that leaders have to rethink this and understand how remote companies work and what they need to do to adapt to this hybrid, semi-remote environment.
Yeah, you've raised a couple of really key, interesting points there from my perspective that I'd love to just dive into. Do you think that the bad habits, so we've got the office, we've got the constraints of the four walls, as you were speaking to. Now, a lot of leaders fall into the habit that things, just because they're saying g'day or catching up with their team, or that there's that general chit-chat in the office, that their roles in relation to communication, say, for example, it's almost like some leaders potentially have that as, well, it's happening, it's a given, I'm communicating with my team. But fundamentally, it may be a bad habit because they're not being intentional or conscious about it. Are you seeing, from what you're experiencing, are you seeing some bad habits of leaders being really laid bare, becoming exposed during the shift to remote leadership?
Yeah, the really big issue here is micromanagement.
Yeah.
So there are lots of little issues about the challenge of transitioning to remote work or hybrid work is, as a leader, you need to move from typically an alpha leader who took decisions and gave instructions to a more consultative coach-like leader who creates the environment for your people to learn, grow, and develop and make decisions.
Yeah.
So that's the first fundamental change that has to happen. And then the second one is, if you are a micromanager and you try to micromanage, your people have to work longer hours to demonstrate that they are working, which ultimately will burn them out and burn you out, because you can't micromanage the way you used to.
Yeah.
And this is an area where I'm seeing a lot of companies struggle to coach their more control freak type natured leaders.
You mentioned trust, and you've mentioned it a couple of times now in respect of new leaders coming into the new environment, I guess, but also in micromanagement, that ability for the control freaks to actually trust that the work's going to happen to a degree. I know a couple of leaders that I work with are very still fearful of work from home remaining, because while they've seen evidence during the pandemic or during the crisis that their people have been effective and productive, they don't believe it's going. They still have this deep-seated belief that it's not going to happen. So what that tells me and what we work on is that there's still that lack of trust. So for leaders in this environment, Brett, how do they build trust? How do they build trust with their team?
Yeah, this is a big challenging area for leaders where trust isn't a natural state. But actually I refer to Project Aristotle, which is Google's. Google did a 2-year research project where they took their high-performing teams and they sliced and diced all the data they had on these teams to try and work out what the difference was between the really high-performing teams and the average teams.
Yeah.
And they looked at everything, and it turned out that the one common factor amongst all high-performing teams was psychological safety. So if you can create an environment of psychological safety, that's the first step towards developing trust.
Yeah.
And the second step towards developing trust is transparency. So remote work companies, every single one I've interviewed and every single one I've researched and studied, demonstrate either very full transparency or as much transparency as is possible. So on the one end of the scale, you've got Buffer, who are openly transparent. You can actually go and work out. There's a calculation on the website where you can go and see exactly what salaries every single body earns.
Wow.
And it's just a calculation. These are the variables, and this is how you work it out. They open the kimono on everything.
Yeah.
There are other companies like GitLab where how they work is fully documented. The GitLab company manual is over 8,000 pages if you were to print it out.
Wow.
And the beauty of the document is it's actually a live working document. There is not a single dud page on the entire document.
Wow.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
And so what these companies do is they are as transparent as possible. And then they build an environment, a psychological safe environment where you can be who you are. You can be yourself. You bring your whole self to work, which means that if you make a mistake or you say something, frankly, silly or stupid, nobody's going to bite your head off. If you make a mistake, people will unpick it and we'll understand it together where you made the mistake, and then we'll help you not make that mistake again. And that then allows people to trust the environment.
Yeah.
So those, for me, are the first two steps. The psychologically safe environment is easier because you can stamp out the behavior that stops you from building a psychological safe environment.
Yeah.
And you can that's relatively easy. But the transparency, there is a gray area of how transparent should I be, where I be. But the more transparent you can be, the better. The more people can trust you because you're not hiding anything from them. So if you don't hide anything from me, I can trust you.
Just while you were talking, I was thinking about Ricardo Semler, and he wrote a book called Maverick so long ago.
That was the first book that I got into, and I went, wow. I got it in my bookcase.
Absolutely, and it's almost like, so many people couldn't believe that was like a business book, and that was the way an organisation would run, where salaries were open and everyone knew that, and the people could pick and choose where they could work and, leave the company and be welcomed back. And so that was, and it's here again, I guess, isn't it? So interesting how transparency, so trust is incredibly important. So Brett, tell me, how do you use this when you're working with your clients?
So what I do with my clients is take them through a process where we define, embed, and manage their culture.
Yeah.
So most of my clients have done some work on their values and mission, and it's aspirational more than anything else. And sometimes it's quite diluted.
Yeah.
And what we do is we understand what the actual culture is versus the aspirational culture. We look at the impediments towards achieving this aspirational culture. Yeah. We then build in a capability around the organization to embed the culture in the leadership team, the functions and processes of the business. And then we teach the leadership team to manage this almost like a function in the business. And so typically I use software that I've built to run the company and teams through this process. And it lasts anything from 3 months to 12 months.
So you talk about what we're seeing now, the lack of cultural development. You're seeing that and I love the way you phrase this. Why the lack of cultural development is its own pandemic. And so organisations that didn't invest in their culture previous to the pandemic, or just allowed it to naturally evolve, which is usually not a great thing, you're seeing that as potentially the next stage of, the ruination of some businesses. Am I reading that correctly with that particular phrase that you've developed?
Yeah, I think yes. In part you are. If you think about what this pandemic is doing to us, it's creating an incredibly stressful, anxiety-filled environment.
Yeah.
And as human beings, we don't like anxiety. We don't like stress. We actually do whatever we can to get out of it. as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
But the reason why I say the lack of culture development is its own pandemic is because if you haven't defined your culture and you haven't defined your values and your mission and your vision, you're essentially hiring people. You're using your gut instinct to work out if they should work with you or not.
Yeah.
And that's not scalable. It's judgmental. There are biases, etc., etc. And so often you find people working in companies that they just shouldn't be in. They stress, they're anxious, they are negative, they are depressed, they are burnt out, which is exactly what's happening in this pandemic. They're in a pandemic type situation because they're in the wrong environment. They were either lied to, or they interpreted what the leader said in one way, and the leader didn't really care anyway because that was really, it doesn't matter. I just needed to hire somebody, and I just need to get blood out of a stone. And so, there is this. I talk about explicit and implicit contracts. The explicit contract is the one we sign with your company, where you pay me and what my bonus is and what my working hours are. The implicit contract is how we're going to work together, how we're going to communicate, what our culture is. And it's easy to not be truthful about the implicit contract to get somebody on board, but that creates anxiety and stress and burnout and depression and unhappiness and bitterness, and so that we don't need that pandemic in the world. If you're going to run a business, for example, like the mafia, then people know what to expect if you go and sign up with the Italian mafia. That culture is quite obvious. If you're going to kneecap somebody, then if you feel sensitive about that, don't join the company.
You know what you get. Yeah, absolutely.
And on the other side, on the other extreme, if you're going to join a charity, when it's not about it's not about cutthroat, brutal kneecapping either, and what you're going to get. But everything in between the mafia and the charity, most companies do not define their culture. So I don't know what I'm going to get, and I have to join your company and go through the pain of learning about your culture to then work out if I want to work here or not. And it's too late because I'm already in and I've invested all of this time, and maybe things will change. Nonsense.
It's painful. So, being a devil's advocate, what do you think is worse, a company that hasn't defined their values, their vision, their culture, or a company that's defined their values but failed to live them?
I think the second one is worse because the leadership are lying.
Yeah.
In the first one, the leadership just don't know. They don't have the experience. They don't know how to do it. That's okay. And hopefully they'll read some books and read some articles and learn over time. But in the second one, culture is this complex, invisible, subconscious, intangible thing that happens mostly below the surface. And the best leaders raise it above the surface of the water so you can see it, so you can touch it, so you can consciously interact with your culture. But it is complex and it is amorphous. But actually, there are only 6 ways to embed company culture. Yeah. It's actually quite simple, theoretically, to embed company culture. So company culture is embedded by what you reward and recognize, what you measure and pay attention to, how you train, mentor, and educate your people, how you invest and allocate resources, how you behave in difficult or crisis situations, and how you hire, fire, and promote. So if you just think about this, if a CEO says customer success is really important to us, it's rah, 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 customer success. But they don't reward or recognize anybody in customer success. They don't hire good people for the team. They don't invest or allocate resources in the team. They don't fire people for behaving badly, or they wipe typically bad behaviors under the carpet. It's clear for everybody in the organization that the CEO is talking out of their nose. They're lying. So actually, but this happens all the time in companies. We say one thing and then we behave in a different way. And that's where the distrust happens, the disconnect with your culture. That's where your culture starts to defray.
And if people can't believe in the culture, if they can't see the culture, they're certainly not going to live it. And, I worked in a number of businesses and organizations that were really quite protective of the culture that they'd built. It was an empowered culture, and there was measures in place for us to recognise our team. There were measures in place where leaders were recognised. It was measured, it was quantifiable, but most importantly, you could see it and sense it. And anyone that worked in some of the companies that I did were very, very proud of the culture that they saw and very proud of the development of the people. So I'm certainly coming from a place where I can understand how culture will define and produce better results than companies that don't have that culture. So you create a great culture, you'll create great results, usually. So when we're talking about leadership, Brett, what do you see nowadays that a leader, what are some of the traits and characteristics leaders need to have to be effective in today?
So communication. What leaders don't realize is staring at the screen does not mean I'm engaged. And it doesn't matter who's talking. If my 1-year-old is yelling and my 3-year-old is broken something and I'm not engaged.
Yeah.
So you have to communicate and over communicate, and you have to say the same thing in different ways at different times. So you've got to focus down on what are the core messages I want to get across, and how am I going to get across them in the written word, in the spoken word, in the recorded word, and how am I going to keep bringing them into different parts of the conversation and reminding people about this. So further on to communication, leaders are talking more about their values and more about their mission and vision because they are thinking about it. Their leadership are thinking about it a lot less, and the team on the ground are not thinking about it at all. And they need to be reminded of it because it's not on the wall. You can't see that. You can't see people's behaviors now.
Yeah.
Leaders are from a trait perspective, are more becoming coaches and listeners and mentors than they are becoming, or than they were that alpha behavior of this is the decision I've taken and this is what we're going to do. And the smart leaders are looking at this new way of working and going, what's the way for me to completely shake this up? I'm seeing leaders who are coming to me and saying, Brett, I'm really concerned that when we go to hybrid work or whatever it is, that productivity is going to fall off a cliff. Because we now have this false productivity moment. People are, because we're in lockdown, people are waking up, walking to their office if they have one, and starting to work. They're not getting on the tube or getting on a bus or getting on a train. They're not getting in their car. They're working. They're having lunch. They're working. They're on Zoom calls all the time, so they're working later. So we're getting 10, 12 hours of work a day from people. And when people can go out and party again and play golf and go to the beach and walk around and meet up with their friends and have a drink, we're going to go back to 8 hours of work again.
Yeah.
If we're lucky. And those 8 hours of work are going to be work in an environment where the systems have not adapted for hybrid work.
Yeah.
So I believe that we're going to experience this from a productivity perspective unless you have really developed this capability around hybrid work or remote work.
Yeah. And just for the listeners, Brett was doing a downward spiral with the this is what we're going to experience. It was easy for me to see it on video, but it was a downward spiral. So, and that's really relevant for leaders to take on board. So how do they arrest that? So
I don't know how long this is going to go on for around the world, but the way to arrest it is really to try and understand what behaviors and what best practices remote companies demonstrate.
Yeah.
Because most companies now are going to have a small or a large percentage of workers who are working remotely. And if you design your business around office communication, synchronous communication, the people who are working remotely are going to feel like second-class citizens because synchronous communication doesn't work for them. With synchronous communication, you need availability and presence, and they may not have availability and presence because they've got kids or they're walking the dog or somebody's delivering a package or whatever it is. So you've got to adapt as a leader. You've got to adapt your working capabilities and your working cadence and your working styles to balancing for people who are not working in the office.
Yeah.
And there are 9 best practices around this area that I've surfaced that I think leaders just need to think about this, because they are serious changes in a business.
Yeah, the way that I'm seeing it with some of the people that I'm working with, I'm really starting to get a sense that what worked in the early days of the pandemic, doing those little catch-ups and communication catch-ups, and there's been some Zoom cocktail hours and, those sorts of things that kept the connection with our team. All of a sudden, I think leaders are starting to think more of, well, what is the next stage? What is the next stage? And I think one of the questions that they're really starting to ask, and I 100% agree with you, that leaders now need coaching skills more than many other things. That ability to listen is just critical. The ability to ask questions, the ability to coach is just a critical skill set for the leaders of today. They're now starting to ask, what I'm seeing is that people are saying, how do I start developing someone to take on the next stage of their career or their role when they're working from home? So I understand now that I've created the connection. We have our morning catch up over coffee or morning tea, and it's just like we're in the office. But the next stage is, how do I start to develop them? Have you given much thought to that?
Yeah, once again, this is what remote work companies are much more deliberate about individual one-to-ones.
Yeah.
And you'll notice that they as leaders, they have much smaller teams, which allows them to do one-to-ones more regularly.
Yeah.
And they will in some companies, they do one-to-ones that have nothing to do with work, nothing to do with what's going on in the business. And they have the leader is not allowed to drive the conversation. The one-to-one is for the employee or the direct report to actually talk and say, this is what's going on in my life. Or if they want to talk about work, great. Or if they want to talk about the weekend, great. Whatever it is, it's just a case of me getting to know you and me understanding where you are, so that if you are under stress, you start to share that with me. If you're not hitting your numbers and you want to share that with me, you can. But I will be aware of your environment, who you are, so that nothing comes as a surprise to me. Leaders are going to get big shocks when they get an email saying, "Can we have a call this week?" And they go on Zoom and they say, "Here's my resignation." Because this has come from nowhere, and I'm really surprised about this. But you weren't talking to me as an individual, as a person. You were talking to me as how are my numbers? You weren't considering my state of work environment. You weren't considering that I felt like a second-class citizen in your company because you weren't building the right culture for me.
So it's some really great thought process for leaders. Now, I'm very much aware that we're up against a hard deadline too, Brett. So I could talk about this all day, and I'm going to have to remain connected, because I think our listeners are going to want to dive into this some more, because it's relevant, it's real, it's what leaders are facing, and whatever tips I know people are really wanting to get a hold of to help them in this current situation. Now, I know that you've got Own Your Culture. It came out last September. But what book had the biggest impact on you as a leader?
Well, actually, you mentioned Ricardo Semler, and when I read that, I was that was a long time ago. I didn't have any grey hair or anything like that. It first came out that it just blew my mind. Yeah. I was like, wow. And I think that set a seed that took a long time to germinate for me. Yeah. But since then, there's a book called An Everyone Culture.
Okay.
And this is a deep dive into 3 companies, Bridgewater, Decurion, and NextJump. And Bridgewater is the big financial services firm, the largest, one of the largest, most successful businesses over the years. But these companies were written about because they've created deliberately developmental organizations, DDOs. And a deliberately developmental organization is an environment where, in these 3 companies, they focus on your weaknesses. And they help you overcome your weaknesses as a function of working at the company.
Wow.
So it's very transparent, quite brutal at Bridgewater, not so brutal at the other two. But when you first read this book, you go, no, no way will you record all of my meetings. No way will you transcribe them. No way will you score me for my believability on the subject after every meeting. No way. It's just, some of it's great. It sounds crazy, but actually, if you go into a deep understanding of that culture, it's what makes them successful. It's the reason for their success. So, and Everyone Culture by Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy. Tremendous book.
And I'll put that link when we post up the podcast. So that sounds fascinating. I haven't read that book personally, so I'm going to go check it out. So out of everything, Brett, that you've accomplished over the last couple of years, what are you most proud of?
It's got nothing to do with work, although it does a little bit. I'm most proud of trying to be a good father and a supportive and good husband. I think the pandemic has really made me realize I need to be more engaged and I need to be a better listener.
Yeah.
And although I'm not there at all by any stretch of the imagination, I'm getting better at it. So that's the thing that I've got a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they don't care about anything except for having fun, and that's really what I'm most proud about.
Excellent. And what's the vision for you moving forward?
There's a couple of interesting things on the horizon. I'm looking to maybe start building some software to solve some of these big hybrid work problems, which will be a separate business to CultureGene. I'm not fully there yet, but it's looking very promising, and I've got a co-founder who I'm working on it with, and this is my passion. So I will be working on culture and learning about culture until the day I die, and hopefully I don't do that too soon, so I can learn a lot.
Absolutely. I'm certainly going to get you back on the podcast because, as I said, we're right up against that hard deadline. How can people connect with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Bretton Putter. CultureGene is my website, which is culturegene.ai. I'm on Twitter as well. If people want to reach out directly, Tony, your audience are more than welcome. I love to talk about company culture and learn about it. So I'm at brett@culturegene.ai, and just happy to chat.
Excellent. Brett, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for investing in today's leader, and keep up the great work.
My pleasure, Tony. Thanks for your time.
Join the group of people impacted by seriously simple stuff to get you unstuck. The first book by Tony Coach Curl. Available at Amazon, Tony's Simple Stuff provides the tool for people to master your life and aspirations. 20% of every book sold supports Carter's cause.
Well, that was episode 287 of the Today's Leader podcast. And what a classic conversation there that we had with Brett from CultureGene. So a big shout out to Brett for investing in today's leaders. And hopefully you've been able to take some real tips, some real advice, some of that gold that Brett shared, and use it within your career, within your business, within your organization. And as promised, you'll find his LinkedIn, his Twitter links in the show notes, as well as a link to his website at CultureGene. Now, one of the things I just want to briefly chat about is the concept of company culture. And when Brett was talking about the ways that great leaders have the ability to consciously lift their culture so that it's visible. Most culture sits beneath the surface, I suppose, if you like to think about that whole iceberg analogy. But consciously, great leaders will lift that culture, the undertones of that culture, transparently and visually out in the open so people can see it, feel it, and touch it. And what I found particularly interesting in relation to that, and absolutely true and relevant, was Brett's concept around the 6 ways to lift company culture. And I'm just going to share them with you. I know Brett spoke about it really quickly in the podcast, But there's some real gold here. So for you to be the leader that you deserve to be, today's leader, there is some real gold here. So think about this in context of your role, your business, your organization, because I'm swear that if you can consciously put actions in and around these 6 ways to lift company culture, you will actually improve your company culture many times over. So let's look at them. Number 1, what you reward and recognize. So what you reward and recognize is a really clear way that people see what's important to the organization. So if you're rewarding compliance when you're actually wanting to drive sales, the reality is that you will see a bureaucratic sales force. So what you reward and recognize is really important in determining the type of culture that you have. What you measure and what you pay attention to is number 2. So what you measure and what you pay attention to. So if you're a leader getting caught up in like the details around micromanaging, all of that sort of stuff, but then talking empowerment, the reality is people are seeing you measuring and paying attention to micromanagement. And that's the type of organization that you're going to have, because you'll have people looking over the shoulder instead of looking forward and being empowered. How you train, mentor, and develop your people is number 3, and that's always been so important. If you really want to drive the best company culture, you need to be working with your team on development plans. So intentional, conscious mentoring. It could be a 30-minute conversation a month where all you do is talk about what the person's goals are, where all you're doing is listening to the person. So how you train, mentor, and develop your people is critical in the creation of company culture. How you invest and allocate resources. So once again, this is really important. If you're investing resources, say in a loss prevention or a logistics mode, obviously those people, and marketing is the one that's getting slammed, but you're not putting money into marketing. You are going to create a culture where that is seen to be unfair. How you behave in difficult situations is number 5. And this would have been evident right throughout the pandemic, right around businesses everywhere. How you, the leader, or how the leadership team in your organization behaved in difficult situations is a barometer for the success of your culture. And the last one is how you hire, fire, and promote. So think about that. How you hire, fire, and promote. John Maxwell always says we should be hiring slow and firing fast. And the last thing that you want to have within your team is the promotion of golden children, whether they're male, female, or what have you. You want to be promoting people that are proven performers, that are credible, that have integrity, and you want to be able to hire slow to make sure you're getting the right hire, but also fire fast at the first signs that it's not going to work out. So there's some really critical aspects there in driving company culture. So once again, just a big shout out to Brett for investing in today's leader. And now is the time for you to take control of your leadership growth in this disruptive world we are all navigating. Our aim is to help you become the leader you need to be today. So if you're looking to build better leadership skills, check out the Today's Leader website at todaysleader.com.au. Our website showcases our podcast. It showcases our magazine, and we're pleased to say that our masterminds are now available all from todaysleader.com.au. Supported by our network sites, of course. Today's Leader is a collective mindset for the leaders and the entrepreneurs for today, forging the path of success for tomorrow. We have the mindset to make a difference, the ability to create the impact. Think and Grow Business hosts our Today's Leader Mastermind, Think and Grow Business, where we focus on personal, professional, and business growth, Book your free 30-minute discovery call at thinkandgrowbusiness.com.au. The discovery call is available right from the homepage. The Coach Curl Academy has over 75 programs to help you build a better you. Join for just $1 for your first month. The Academy equips you and enhances mindset, leadership, and business. Check it out at thecoachcurlacademy.com. You are standing stronger, braver, and wiser. Don't forget the golden rule. You know what it is. Don't be an arsehole. I'll see you all again next week. Bye for now.